The following podcast is banned in the state of Florida for talking about a dangerous leftist book, the Bible. Like the Bible, this podcast contains frank discussions on sensitive topics, including sex, violence, and cursing. Please proceed with caution.
Godliness is a great source of profit when it is combined with being happy with what you already have. We didn't bring anything into the world, and so we can't take anything out of it. We will be happy with food and clothing. But people who are trying to get rich fall into temptation. They are trapped by many stupid and harmful passions that plunge people into ruin and destruction. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some have wandered away from the faith and have impaled themselves with a lot of pain because they have made money their goal. This is the word in black and red. Welcome to the Word in Black and Red, where we read the Bible from a leftist and liberationist perspective to elucidate the way people of faith and their comrades can understand the Bible as a source of healing, love, and liberation for all people. I am your host, Micah the Wise Old Llama MB, joined today by the wonderful Brandon Johnson, aka the Translator from the Found in Translation podcast, where he is slowly translating the Liberation and Inclusion translation.
So it's lit.
It is. It's the lit Bible.
It's lit.
Yeah.
Nice. All right.
The lit Bible translation. And two other wonderful guests. A W. Scott McAndless from the Retelling the Bible podcast, and a wonderful community member, Ben, who is just a wonderful part of our Discord community. And you can be a wonderful part of our Discord community as well by following the link in the description.
Be one of the cool kids.
Yeah. I also always love to encourage folks to come and hang out with us at the Llama Pack, the ministry that gave birth to the Word in Black and Red. But I forget to plug it too often, so taking that opportunity here while I remember. Well, friends, thank you all for being here as we discuss the first Passover, Exodus 11 through 12:28. The Lord said to Moses, "I'll bring one more disaster on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he'll let you go from here. In fact, when he lets you go, he'll eagerly chase you out of here. Tell every man to ask his neighbor and every woman to ask her neighbor for all their silver and gold jewelry." The Lord made sure that the Egyptians were kind to the Hebrew people. In addition, Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptian people even came to honor Moses as a great and important man in the land. Moses said, "This is what the Lord says. At midnight I'll go throughout Egypt. Every oldest child in the land of Egypt will die. From the oldest child of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the oldest child of the servant woman by the millstones, and all the first offspring of the animals. Then a terrible cry of agony will echo through the whole land of Egypt, unlike any heard before or that ever will be again. But as for the Israelites, not even a dog will growl at them, at the people or at their animals. By this you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Then all your officials will come down to me, bow to me, and say, 'Get out, you and all your followers.' After that I'll leave." Then Moses, furious, left Pharaoh. The Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh won't listen to you so that I can perform even more amazing acts in the land of Egypt." Now Moses and Aaron did all these amazing acts in front of Pharaoh, but the Lord made Pharaoh stubborn, so that he didn't let the Israelites go from his land. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month will be the first month. It will be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole Israelite community, on the 10th day of this month, they must take a lamb for each household, a lamb per house. If a household is too small for a lamb, it should share one with a neighbor nearby. You should divide the lamb in proportion to the number of people who will be eating it. Your lamb should be a flawless year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You should keep close watch over it until the 14th day of this month. At twilight on that day, the whole assembled Israelite community should slaughter their lambs. They should take some of the blood and smear it on the 2 doorposts and on the beam over the door of the houses in which they are eating. That same night they should eat the meat roasted over the fire. They should eat it along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Don't let any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over fire with its head, legs, and internal organs. Don't let any of it remain until morning, and burn any of it left over in the morning. This is how you should eat it. You should be dressed, with your sandals on your feet and your walking stick in your hand. You should eat the meal in a hurry. It is the Passover of the Lord. The blood will be your sign on the houses where you live. Wherever I see the blood, I'll pass over you. No plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. I'll pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I'll strike down every oldest child in the land of Egypt, both humans and animals. I'll impose judgments on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. This day will be a day of remembering for you. You will observe it as a festival to the Lord. You will observe it in every generation as a regulation for all time. You will eat unleavened bread for 7 days. On the first day you must remove yeast from your houses, because anyone who eats leavened bread any time during those 7 days will be cut off from Israel. The first day and the 7th day will be a holy occasion for you. No work at all should be done on those days, except for preparing the food that everyone is going to eat. That is the only work you may do. You should observe the festival of unleavened bread, because on this precise day I brought you out of the land of Egypt in military formation. You should observe this day in every generation as a regulation for all time. In the first month, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day, you should eat unleavened bread. For 7 days no yeast should be found in your houses, because whoever eats leavened bread will be cut off from the Israelite community, whether the person is an immigrant or a native of the land. You should not eat anything made with yeast in all your settlements. You should eat only unleavened bread. Then Moses called together all of Israel's elders and said to them, Go pick out one of the flocks for your families, and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood that is in the bowl, and touch the beam above the door and the 2 doorposts with the blood in the bowl. None of you should go out the door of your house until morning. When the Lord comes by to strike down the Egyptians and sees the blood on the beam above the door and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over that door. God won't let the destroyer enter your houses to strike you down. You should observe this ritual as a regulation for all time for you and your children. When you enter the land that the Lord has promised to give you, be sure that you observe this ritual. When your children ask you, What does this ritual mean to you? You will say, It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For the Lord passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. When God struck down the Egyptians, God spared our houses. The people then bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites went and did exactly what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron to do. Now, dear listener, if you listen closely to these biblical passages and don't just press 15 all the way through it, you'll notice that these passages seem to be repeating themselves a lot, as if it's almost 2 different stories merged into one.
Well, it seems to be exactly that. There are at least 2 sources at work in this, at least according to the documentary or hypothesis. It starts as the so-called E-source for the first little while. Then there's a bit of a redaction in the middle, and then a middle part that is attributed to the priestly author. And then when it once again describes what Moses is saying about giving the instructions to the people, it goes back to the original E-source. That's at least the theory, according to the documentary hypothesis, that we have these 2 different stories of the first Passover that have been jammed together there. And that's why you get these weird repetitions. Different concerns seem to come from the different authors in these 2 versions of the story.
Yeah, the 2 stories seem pretty different. It looks like the P-source is concerned about this ritualistic feast that's happening, where you eat this unblemished lamb. You eat all of it, and anything that you don't eat, you burn in the morning. And you're supposed to have all of these accoutrements that sound like you have to get ready to go. You have to be dressed, you have to wear your sandals, you have to eat unleavened bread so that you're not waiting around for the bread to go, and you have to eat bitter herbs. So that's, on the one hand, talking about this Passover story, and it includes the smearing of the blood over the doorposts, but it isn't about that. It's primarily about the ritualistic feast. It doesn't have anything here about why you should do the blood over the doorpost. The E-source that is very concerned with why you're doing this ritual and isn't concerned at all with the feast. this ritual that is very concerned with putting the thing over the doorpost so that the angel of death doesn't come and kill your children, as if, the angel of death has a list and is checking it twice, and the blood on your door means that you aren't on the list. And so it's almost like there's two completely different rationales behind each of these stories.
Absolutely, yes. And I notice also the P source in the middle is very, very concerned with leaven. The other story doesn't seem to be concerned at all with it. I don't think yeast even comes up in that story. I think it comes up a little bit later in that source. But there is almost like a horror. It's not just that you eat unleavened bread. It must be nowhere in your house during this entire period. It's like this contamination that has to be absolutely eliminated from every house. So it's this dangerous, dangerous thing that totally defiles every household, every family. And there's not a hint of that in the other part of the story.
And this is also one of the things that defines the priestly source. The priestly source is very concerned about ritual and cleanliness versus the e-source, which is very concerned about basically making God as powerful as God can possibly be. And so here, God has the power to murder all of these people from the highest on down, or to the lowest.
Noticing the different voices that input into the story, into the document that we have now, inspires me to have more confidence in hearing it in a variety of ways with different emphases and taking the validity of different ways of interacting with the story in that way too.
Absolutely. So for me, I think that this story is one of these etiological stories where it's a story of why things are the way that they are. Why is there a rainbow in the sky? Well, that's because God put their bow in the sky to signify that the earth would never again be flooded. It's a sign of God's promise that that won't happen again. And so that is an etiological story here. ETIO, logical, in case anybody wants to Google and deep dive on that, because there's lots of fun examples from all sorts of cultures that are all seeking to have a story to explain why things are the way they are. And here, the priestly source seems to be that kind of story, that we are doing this thing because this Passover was celebrated at this time. Probably, actually, what the Passover is it's a feast of the harvest time, and you're celebrating it during a time when you are really busy. So you don't necessarily have time to bake bread. You just have time to make something really easy, like unleavened bread, to be able to go out into the field. And so you have this bread that has to be eaten very quickly that you're then coming up with a reason for, right? And you're taking this thing that is very mundane and giving it spiritual significance, like a lot of the things that we do in our lives. We take something that is very mundane and we recognize the ways that God is already at work. And it becomes a way of connecting with God, like a strange book that two different people have written different opinions on that somehow still connects us with God.
Yeah, it probably originated, like you say, it's a harvest festival, probably the early barley harvest. And the nice thing about barley is it makes this beautiful, very tasty flat bread that you don't have to leaven. And so, yeah, naturally, when the early barley was harvested, people made these lovely flat breads that didn't need to rise, and it was a wonderful time of celebration. And yet all of these stories then got piled onto that harvest festival. I believe it may have even originated in the Persian Empire, that this might have been a festival that the exilic people learned from the Persians and brought back and gave their own significance to. But what a significance they added to it, obviously, with this incredible story.
I was looking up earlier today, and I was discussing the historic origins of the Passover festival and theorizing that it's a synchronization of two different festivals. The hunter part of it with the lamb and the smearing of the blood, which they said was maybe to ward off demons.
I mean, the angel of death.
Or the destroyer.
If you're going to call anything a demon.
Yeah, fair. The other part being the farmers, the agricultural part of it being the unleavened bread. And it's those two rituals happening around the same time getting kind of combined into one thing, but Easter taking a lot from pagan fertility ritual and then rolling that into a celebration of the resurrection of Christ. It's oh, hey, we have this thing that's happening at the same time. Let's just combine them.
Mm-hmm.
Or our thing is your thing. Do our religion.
which that eventually happens with Easter and Passover. Like, you just kind of took Passover and put it into the Easter story in the church.
That's kind of why Christmas is December 25th, right?
Sol Invictus.
Bible doesn't say he was born then, but hey, Sol Invictus.
I think there's a good argument that Sol Invictus is actually based on Christmas, but that's a whole other discussion.
And we'll get there, I'm sure, yes.
Yeah, eventually. The earliest calendars that we have Christmas, but don't have Sol Invictus until later. So here we do have this connection that comes very quickly to the mind of Christians, because the Last Supper that Jesus is celebrating is a Passover. I was very excited to have a rabbi join us tonight. They unfortunately were not able to make it last minute, but it's important to note that the kind of Passover that Jesus was celebrating looked a lot more like this than the kind of Passover that modern Jewish folks were celebrating, but it was also modified and had changed by the time of Jesus' time. I was just listening to a podcast earlier that was talking about the fact that tradition is only ever about 40 years old. And we always look back about 40 years ago and go, that's how it's always been done, when in fact it's just about 40 years prior that there was probably a change to what is we now consider the ancient tradition. And that's normal and beautiful, and there's lots of change that happens over time. And there's also some more stability around things, particularly when they get written down, but even that changes over time. The point being that a living tradition is something that changes. It's something that adapts. It's something that understands itself in new metaphors. It's something that adapts itself to be relevant at different times. And so Jesus had a different Passover than this ancient version of it. And modern Jewish people also have a very different Passover, a different Seder, than the kind that Jesus had. Now, we can say that Passover was adapted to a Christian context and say that that happened in the form of communion, but that does not give us the right to go and say, well, now we can do Passovers ourselves. Now, if you are invited to a Jewish Seder, go, please, and go and learn. Don't go and learn and go, oh, Jesus is here and Jesus is there. Instead, recognize that it's a different religious practice that has different meaning that you can still connect to as a Christian and can help you love your neighbors better. But if you are not invited to a Seder, don't try to put one on yourself. Because this is a tradition for our siblings that was established by God or by this ancient tradition as a special sign of relationship between them. And so, all that to say, that the loving thing to do to our neighbor is not to try and celebrate a Passover that isn't meant for us as outsiders.
Yeah, some people have a real hard time with that idea.
You mean everything isn't meant for me, a white person? What?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're really shaking my worldview here, Micah. If it wasn't made for me, a straight white man, then why is it here?
I love that the second thing that God is concerned about is Pharaoh's going to let you go and he's going to chase you out of here. But before he chases you out of here, make sure that all the Egyptians already know that they're going to hand over all the money.
Yeah, I mean, it's restitutionary atonement. Spoiler, as we go further into Exodus, like that becomes the way of justice. It's restitutionary, which means making things right, as opposed to like American justice system is retributive justice, which is punishing the wrongdoer. But Exodus in particular, but the Bible largely has a huge focus on, you might even call it like reparations, right? Like it's a sense of, if I hurt you in some way, then I owe you a way to make it better. And it might be painful for me, right? If I stole something from you, I'm going to owe you back not only what I stole, but like 4 or 5 times more than what I stole to repair that for you. Yeah, that's painful, but that's not the point, is that it's painful for me. The point is that it's good for the person who was wronged. That's what essentially the core of what restitutionary justice is.
The next funny thing that I really enjoy in verse 3 is this is a little bit like the line in Numbers when Moses' siblings call him out on having just established laws about not intermarrying with outsiders and then immediately marrying a Cushite woman. And they're like, hey, dude, what's with that? And then the book of Numbers is like, and Moses was the most humble man who had ever lived. This is very much so the same kind of vibes. In addition, Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptian people even came to honor Moses as a great and important man in the land.
It is pretty incredible, yes. And yet in verse 9, Pharaoh doesn't even listen to him. And yet he's the most important man. It's immediately contradicted, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like how at the end of chapter 10, then Pharaoh said to him, "Get away from me. Take care that you do not see my face again, for on that day you shall see my face and you shall die." And Moses said, "Just as you say, I'll never see your face again." And then 9 verses later, they're talking to each other again.
Yep.
It's almost like there are different authors telling different stories, and one person's dramatic ending wasn't enough. Yeah. One thing that is really interesting to note here is that if you follow the logic of the story, that every oldest child in the land of Egypt will die, from the oldest child of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the oldest child of the servant woman by the millstones, and all of the first offspring of the animals, is that Moses and Pharaoh were presumably raised in the same household. The previous Pharaoh might have had lots of sons and daughters, but at least one of them adopted Moses. And so these two probably know each other. They probably have an intimate relationship with each other within the context of the story. It's totally possible that whoever wrote the infancy narrative of Moses has no idea what's happening throughout the rest of the story. But if we take it that that's the case, then they know each other. And Moses probably knows that Pharaoh was not the firstborn son, which means that they probably had another relative who was supposed to be king instead, and that person died when they were much younger. And so Pharaoh and Moses are people who were raised in the same household, have experienced this deep loss of the death of a sibling that came too early, and then this Pharaoh was suddenly thrown into the ranks of power, probably when he didn't expect to be. Because otherwise this Pharaoh would die when the angel of death came. And so this Pharaoh is suddenly in this position of power he didn't expect to be. He has all these problems he doesn't really understand. He's inherited a dysfunctional system where the previous Pharaoh had murdered a bunch of the Hebrew children, and he suddenly has to deal with his angry little brother showing up and protesting against the way that he's running his kingdom. And this person that he probably once loved is now his greatest enemy in the world. And so that line of, "You'll never see my face again," to me is chock full of all this emotional family turmoil that's happening here. And here in this story, Moses yells this thing at Pharaoh and then leaves furious instead of staying and in any way engaging with him.
That's a good point. If this Pharaoh had been a firstborn, then he would have died. Because you never really think about adults dying as part of this plague. It's always like, oh, the firstborn children died. And the thing was like, well, no, firstborn adults are still firstborn, so it applies to them too. I never really thought of that.
Yeah, there's nothing in the text to say that it's just firstborn children. The word is bekor, and it is just firstborn. So it isn't necessarily children. It doesn't imply that there's a specific age that anyone has. The only time that it's ever specifically eldest son is when it's referencing literally the oldest son, like Reuben. But otherwise, it's a vague word. It doesn't imply that it is limited to children, and it doesn't imply that it's limited to male or female children.
Yeah, I think that insight about the emotionality of it is like so much of the telling of the Bible stories in my experience has been just extremely intellectualized, very cognitive, just no heart in it at all. And as I've found going through the New Testament and talking about when Jesus does a lot of his healings, traditionally it's like touched their hand or whatever. It's like, no, it says he held their hand. Come on, make this person more human. And I think that's the same thing here. It's like you kind of reading it as two strangers, but putting in the backstory that your insight is leading you to. And like, these people know each other, probably grew up together, and like, yeah, you'll never see me again takes on a new meaning when it's estranged brothers than when it's just like leaders of two different people groups.
It's been a while since I watched it, but isn't that like the central like dramatic thrust of the Prince of Egypt? Is like, oh, they were raised as brothers, and now they have to hate each other because X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, they did a good job of trying to include that element.
That is usually played up in the movies, yeah, even in Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments, yeah.
That deep family tie also ties back to the reason that the Hebrew people are here is because Joseph and his brothers had this huge conflict that tore them apart. And eventually they reconciled, but the pain of that terror, that loss of power that Joseph had, caused Joseph to amass power in the role of the Pharaoh, and thus giving the Pharaoh the ability to enslave Joseph's entire family. And here we see once again this brotherly conflict at the core of this dysregulation, of this tearing apart, of this sinful relationship that comes to be here. And it goes back to the very beginning, right? The first murder was Cain and Abel, two brothers who are irrevocably divided because something causes them to disagree, to be set against each other. And so Pharaoh's clinging to power and Moses' clinging to liberation causes that family to break up as well. Now, if there's any good reason to never see your sibling again, it's because you're fighting for the liberation of other people. But
yeah,
but it's still sad.
Bringing up Joseph, that puts a bit of a darker spin on Moses was a great and important man in the land, because Joseph was a great and important man in the land. Look what he did.
Yeah, like taking it as whose perspective here are we talking about? If it's somebody that someone like Pharaoh would call a great and important man, like that's a different value set than how we're reading this.
Especially given what's just about to happen.
It makes me think of basically every civil rights hero that America now upholds as a good symbol of what we should be. The version of Martin Luther King that we hold up is a frankly whitewashed version where the only thing he says is, "I have a dream," and then bam, racism is solved. And you go straight from Martin Luther King to Barack Obama, and nothing happened in between.
Or after.
Yeah, exactly. Abraham Lincoln, and then somehow things happened that went crazy, and then Martin Luther King, and then everything was fixed, and then you have Obama. And like those are the only three important parts of history. When in fact, Martin Luther King was killed probably less because of his civil rights activism, and more because he was openly a socialist.
And opposed the war.
And that it was a threat to the state. Now, I'm not saying the CIA killed Martin Luther King, but also I would not be surprised if we find that out in the next couple of decades. The problem with conspiracy theories is that you have to see a conspiracy where there isn't one, but the American government is constantly a conspiracy against people who are seeking liberation. And so this whitewashing of Martin Luther King's legacy, how would the Egyptians have seen Moses as this great liberator? How would they have whitewashed Moses in this way as well? So this is another one of the plagues that, under this e-source, doesn't affect the Israelites. In the time of great darkness, the Israelites were still able to see, and here they will not have any sort of suffering or death that happens. The Israelites were still able to get their water, weren't affected by the plagues of lice, their animals weren't affected. Their exclusion from all of this, once again, makes it the sort of symbol of death, the symbol of overpowering the systems of Egypt.
But there is one element that is kind of unique in this one that I can't help but underline and say how strange it is. Because in all those other plagues, God has absolutely no trouble whatsoever finding the Israelites and distinguishing them and not making sure that it doesn't happen. But in this one, every single Israelite family has to go to the trouble, because God doesn't know all of a sudden, apparently, of marking their house so that they are excluded. And it's not even like the whole Israelite community living together. It's every single house. And if one house doesn't do the marking, well, that's too bad. They just get killed, apparently. That is this strange difference that all of a sudden God doesn't know what God has known all along throughout all of these plagues. Where are the Israelites? That one led me down a deep rabbit hole. As I dug down the rabbit hole, I did find there is, in fact, another story of Passover in the Bible that is actually quite different. If you go over to Ezekiel chapter 45, 18 to 25, there is in the book of Ezekiel a description of what Passover is supposed to be. In that passage, the blood is placed on the doorposts and the lintel of the temple. So it's the temple itself that is marked with the blood, and that's what's supposed to protect and purify the whole people. And yet what we have in Exodus and other accounts of the Passover is that instead of that Passover being controlled by the priests in the temple, it has now become the property of the entire people. So every family has to do it. And so it could be that what we have in Exodus is a kind of revolt against priestly power. That maybe originally this Passover was this national thing that was held at the temple that was controlled by the priest, and the priests were the ones who controlled this blessing of God by marking the temple. And what we have in Exodus is an anti-priestly revolt where the people, maybe led by the Levites or some other group of people, took that festival back to themselves and they said, no, we want to observe it each in our own home. But then becomes the problem because the nation then becomes divided because some people want to do it in the old way. Like you said, people get really hung up on traditions. So some people just wanted to keep doing it in the old way. And some people said, no, we're going to do the Passover, each of us in our own houses. And so was it possible that at some point there was this division in the people and there were some people who were doing Passover at home? And if they didn't mark their homes, were there maybe even roving bands of quote unquote destroyers who went around and attacked families that weren't observing Passover in the way that they thought? And that what we have in Exodus might be a remembrance of that time of transition from one kind of Passover to another. Like I said, it's a rabbit hole. I went down it. It's maybe a conspiracy theory, but there's something going on here that I think is kind of weird.
I like that theory. I think that would put an extra little bit of significance on Moses and Aaron being Levites, being of the priestly class, giving this festival or this ceremony to the people. It's like, oh, look, no, like the people that you claim your lineage from said it's us, not you. So like a bit of an appeal to authority.
This is a messy history. As these people worked out these festivals and what they all thought was pleasing God, they were probably not all united. Their nations were probably as divided as our nations are these days. There were people on this side and there were people on that side. I especially think this whole idea of marking your house with this very visible signal that this is how we celebrate Passover. And those people over there or those people across the street who aren't marking their doors, they're not good Jews. And they deserve to be destroyed, whether or not there were roving bands or not. But this was exactly the kind of thing that probably did divide people at some point in their history. And I don't know when. It may have been early, it may have been late, but this kind of division likely happened. I'm looking at you guys in your country and the Democrats and the Republicans, but we have the same thing up here in Canada. We can't talk to each other. We are just totally the left and right. They're unacceptable. They're enemies. They're heretics. We can't talk to them. And so if you don't have the right kind of flag, whatever it might be, whether it be the rainbow flag or the appeal to heaven flag in front of your house, you're not acceptable. Well, this is exactly the kind of thing that I see with this blood on the doorposts. You're virtue signaling for your household.
I love that interpretation because it helps us to emphasize the fact that like the centrality of the temple is one of the central debates that happens throughout the history of ancient Israelite religion and then First Temple Judaism and then Second Temple Judaism, out of which both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity come. In ancient Israelite religion, Solomon or someone else, but in the Bible attributed to Solomon, built the temple probably in the 10th century, somewhere around 930 BC. And it is the central temple, but that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of other temples going on throughout the area. In fact, the Levites, who Moses and Aaron belonged to, are distributed throughout the kingdom of Israel because they are supposed to be priests all throughout the area. Scott has a wonderful episode about a Levite where the Levite sets up a very local shrine for one of the Micahs in the Bible, and then the Benjaminites come down and are like, hey, wouldn't you rather come and be a priest for us than for just this one dude? So the Levites were local priests who were carrying out the divine priesthood all over the place, probably in worship of lots of different gods at local levels, but that was their job. And so the centralization of the religion doesn't really happen until 622, when the book of Deuteronomy is discovered. And we say discovered. I also love an episode that Scott has about the discovery of the book of Deuteronomy.
Yes.
Dear listeners, you can't see, but we're putting up lots of bunny ears when we say discovery.
Discovered.
Yeah, exactly. Because the book of Deuteronomy was probably written by the priestly class that were trying to centralize Israelite religion to the Temple of Jerusalem, specifically in resistance to the temples that had existed in what was now the Kingdom of Israel in the north half, and they wanted to centralize religious worship in the Kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem was its capital.
Because there's a lot of money in centralized worship. Money and power.
Exactly. Despite the fact that that would be like a week's worth of travel for the poorest people coming down to do the ritual. And you're supposed to do that 3 times a year. And so that's like 6 weeks of vacation that you have to use on just getting to Jerusalem and then back instead of, on resting like God had told us to. And so the temple in Jerusalem is one among many. And then in 622, it becomes the very most important one. And then 587, it gets destroyed. So less than 50 years after it becomes the most important temple, it's destroyed. And so there is lots of room within that to say that there are local practices that adapt in different areas and are different attempts of people trying to live out their faith in an appropriate manner. So I love the idea that this is a story that's being told and saying, no, we're going to do this on our own. The priests don't have to do it for us. We're going to do it on our own. We're going to make sure that our houses are safe. Even if those bastards down in Jerusalem who keep trying to make me go a week there and a week back keep telling me what to do, I'm still going to do my religious practice. And that sort of adaptability is what allows, after the temple is rebuilt, and the temple exists for about 600 years after that point, but after that temple collapses, that allows Jewish people to still hold on to a Jewish identity and practices in various ways throughout the diaspora. Wherever they go, they're able to hold on to a Judaism that it becomes Rabbinic Judaism because there was always that little bit of flexibility. There was always that there is a central worship, but also we do our own thing in our village. And so to me, the big thing to come away with there is there's lots of different good ways to love God. There's lots of good ways to worship God. And we're going to read a lot of priestly sources in the next couple of books that are like, no, this is the one way to do it. But the subtle undertone of that is that this is the one way to do it because all of y'all have been doing it your own way for hundreds of years at this point. And we want to be the only game in town that gets to do it. And so when people are like, well, you need to join my church because we're doing these things properly. A, only the Episcopal Church does it right. And B, no, it doesn't. Everybody has their own legitimate forms of worship that are different and help us connect with the divine in different ways in our own local contexts. And even though I joke that the Episcopal Church is the only true church, it's just the way that I have found that I connect best with God. Right now, in my particular context, in a couple of years, I might find that it's not the thing that I need to connect with God. And that's okay, too. I will have put in a lot of work to become a priest if God pulls that out from under me. But, God and I will have words.
You'll work it out.
Yeah.
I would assume that the E story is the older one, the P story, with the emphasis on getting the ritual right and getting the yeast out of your house and all of that stuff. That is a concern that a bunch of priests came up with probably just after the exile and said, no, we need to do this stuff right. They didn't want to take out the original story, but they felt they needed to put it right in the middle there to make sure that people did this right. It's priests saying, yeah, but we know best. I think we all know that priests like to do that kind of thing.
So we've talked about why this is possibly going on in historical perspective, but within the context of the story, I think that question that Scott posed is still a really good one. Why is it that God suddenly needs help identifying where the Hebrews live?
I tend to think it's sort of like this virtue signaling thing, that we need to put up our flag and say we're the right kind of Israelite to be acceptable to God. It's about declaring ourselves in the community as being the right kind of person. But you can't reconcile these plagues, honestly, anywhere. I mean, how can the firstborn of all the animals in Egypt be killed in this plague? Because they were all killed about 5 plagues ago. They're all dead. You can't really reconcile all of these plagues anyway. But there is something unique about this. Yeah, you got to identify yourselves. God doesn't know all of a sudden, and you got to identify yourselves.
I'm wondering if it's less that God needs to know who not to murderize, but that it's like an extra kick in the teeth the next morning when all the Egyptians wake up and find out what's happened, and then they say, oh, it didn't happen in these houses. Oh, what's in those? Oh, the Israelites, it didn't happen to them. A visual identifier for the Egyptians more than a sign for God to be like, oh, nope, not supposed to go here. Okay, next door.
And another thing I would just throw it in as possibility is it's not really clear, I would suggest, in the story, who's doing the killing. Sometimes it's God, sometimes it's the angel of death, and sometimes it's the destroyer. Who is doing this? There might be a sense in which God has deputized someone to do the killing, and that's who needs the marking. And it might be human beings that God has deputized to do the killing. So yeah, it could be these roving gangs of murderers who are going around killing people, and they need to know which houses to go to and which ones not to. There's one way to read it, because it is kind of vague. It's not entirely clear who's killing who in this story.
God's like, I'm going to come down and do this. And then Moses is like, oh, God's going to send his destroyer to do it. It's like, well, hold on, that's not what God told you.
Why is leaven unclean?
But leaven isn't unclean. Leaven is unclean for Passover. I think they definitely understood. Leaven, yeast, is this incredibly valuable thing that transforms bread, it transforms beer. I mean, where would we be without beer? Leaven is this powerful, life-giving thing. It's not unclean. It's not dangerous. It's just you need to take a break from something this powerful. It's the same way that women are unclean when they're bleeding, for example, or after giving birth or something like that. But it's not that there's something wrong with them. It's that there's something incredibly powerful about them, that they are connected to life and bringing new life. And it's not that they're dangerous or dirty. It's that they have this incredible power that you need to respect. I think it's kind of the same thing with yeast. It has this incredible power to transform foods and drinks to make them amazing. But it's so powerful that you need to take a break from it. You need to get a time with it out of your household. But it's not a bad thing. It's certainly not a dirty thing or anything like that.
If you're thinking of it in terms of that piece of things being part of the priestly tradition, where these rituals are being added to remind later generations what happened or what we are telling the story as, and the significance of that, then that tie to power or not, that sense of, things are going well now, but our ancestors had it really rough. Don't lose touch with your roots. Don't forget where you came from. And there's this very physical reminder of my bread is different this week. And that comes from the hardship that my ancestors went through. And I need to keep identifying with people in hardship and not just see myself as above that.
My favorite obscure podcast is called Throwing Shade, and shade is SHEYD. And it's a podcast on Jewish demonology. And one of the things that they talk about there is that you can't smile too much at your baby, according to one of these folk tales, because smiling too much at the baby invites the evil eye. And it implies this idea that too much of something invites its opposite. Taking too much joy in something invites the evil eye. And that the power of life being so great then invites death into that space. And so the mixture of those two things is the thing that's unclean itself. And that is, I think, a lot of what's behind the uncleanliness throughout the Old Testament. this idea that the menstrual cycle is this ultimate symbol of life. And so it makes you ritually unclean to go and approach the sacrificial system in the temple, which is all about death and blood in the opposite direction. Menstrual blood is the blood that symbolizes life, and blood sacrificed at the temple symbolizes life, but also through the process of dying, instead of the process of bringing new life. And so it's that sort of mixture that shouldn't be mixed against each other. It's the same reason why men who have a genital emission of any kind are also not supposed to approach the temple, which means that men are probably going to be ritually unclean more often than women are. I just want to point that out generally, that the average man has his genital emissions like 20 out of 30 days of a month, and the average woman only has genital emission for about 7 days out of the month. So if people are going around saying that women are unclean, stick in your own eye, or perhaps in your own hand, and that's the problem.
Paint us a picture, Micah. Yes.
Yeah. I think that's what's happening here, is that we have exactly what you're saying, this symbol of life, this thing that is able to make life so much more enjoyable and make so many more things that we are able to enjoy and celebrate and that sort of thing, in contrast to the death that is happening, the death of the lamb here, and ultimately the death of all of the firstborn.
The reminder of our ancestors were the oppressed. No matter what our situation is now, let's make sure that we're siding with the people like our ancestors, not like the people in Egypt.
And then we burn the lamb entirely. That's a weird little note that I'm not sure why is in there.
If you just throw the bones outside your house, you'll have rats and you'll have all kinds of scavengers and people going to get sick. This is good public health, which I think a lot of sacrificial stuff is. It's burning up the parts that you can't eat that are going to attract bad animals and vermin and create sickness. That's what most sacrifices are. You eat the good stuff and you give the rest to God, and it's burnt up and nobody gets sick because God's happy, right? But when you have a distributed sacrifice like this, where you have lambs slaughtered all over the place, not in the one central place, which seems to be what's envisioned here, yeah, you have to dispose properly of the bones and the leftovers, or everyone will get sick, which I guess is an indication that God is mad because you did it wrong. That's their basic understanding of how these things worked.
Very simple cause and effect, yeah.
Yeah, it does also seem kind of like there's like an emphasis on just reducing waste in general. It's like, okay, well, if your family's too small to get a lamp, do Passover with someone else. Don't get a lamp for 2 people.
Because you have to consume it all.
Yeah, maybe there's some years where people weren't eating all of their lamb, and then so it caused sickness. It's like, okay, you need to burn the lamb. Like, you don't eat it, burn it. Like, try to eat it all, but if you don't, get rid of it.
And there was no Tupperware and there were no refrigerators. And that's the reality.
Well, and speaking of not having modern technology and thus depending on lots of other things, hyssop in this story, you're supposed to take the swig of hyssop and go and paint with that over the area. Now, everything I'm about to say is stolen directly from notes that Elle took, because Elle is a huge plant person and wanted us to know lots of details about hyssop. There's a Hebrew word, we're not sure quite exactly what it means. But hyssop is the strange plant that's probably called Syrian oregano, a minty kind of plant that is native to southern Europe and the Middle East and all this area around the Caspian Sea. It's supposed to be an antiseptic, so it is, again, playing into that sort of life versus death sort of thing. The antiseptic is supposed to help keep you a little bit clean as you're doing the blood on the wall, and it's used in all sorts of traditional medicine. It's also part of the oldest incense that archaeologists have found, and so it has this deep, important metaphor as a scent. We're going to read a lot in the rest of the Torah, again, about sweet-smelling things going up to God. That a lot of the sacrifice is just about providing sweet-smelling scents, and so hyssop was part of that scent collective. But one of the things that's really important to note is that this herb is really precious in the Levant, which means that native Palestinians will go out and forage and gather it to be able to use it in incense and as a medicine and all these other things. But the government of Israel outlawed collecting wild hyssop that can result in prosecution and these huge fines. So wild hyssop and sage are both protected under Israeli law as these endangered plants, but there's been no studies on whether or not the plants are still there, or any further research, or trying to develop any sort of path to their reproduction since 1977. So it's pretty clear that the only reason this law exists is so that the Palestinian people cannot go and safely gather up the hyssop that is a huge part of their culture. It's a huge part of tradition that is going back all the way back to this first institution, which also means that Jewish people are not able to get access to the very specific kind of plant that they are told to use in this ritual all the way back. Now, lots of Jewish congregations and groups use other things than hyssop. A lot of the time, you can just use sage or a mint. Don't quote me on that. This is why we were going to have a rabbi. But you can use other herbs to accomplish the same thing. The bitter herbs are taken a little bit more broadly since it's not as clear. But this is something that is a law that's imposed to hurt people by a government that is not seeking to protect things, but instead just seeking to be cruel. And so as we're reflecting on this story and saying this is a way to remind us of the suffering of our siblings that we have to remember and not be like Egypt, we have to remember that this is happening in the modern nation to people who are not able to get this thing that is part of their diet, it's part of their everyday life, that is being oppressed and wiped out from their culture because of the display of power that the state of Israel is now enacting against the Palestinian people.
You remind me of an experience I had just a couple of weeks ago, because I was at the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and we had a very moving afternoon. We did an apology for the First Nations Indigenous peoples several years ago, but we renewed it and got much more specific about our participation in genocide and the residential schools and some very specific brutal things. But we did it in a context where it started with the Indigenous people purifying the space for us using almost the same herbs, burning the four sacred, the sage, the tobacco, the sweetgrass, and the cedar for us. It was a real privilege to be part of that. It's a reminder that just the access to these very simple herbs, the healing power, and the ongoing participation in this kind of injustice and genocide that needs to be healed. Wherever there is a settler colonial situation, which there is in Israel as much as in North America, this is exactly the kind of healing and the kind of herbs and plants that have been used for healing by the people indigenous to these areas. They're there to bring healing for all of us. You brought me back to where I was a couple of weeks ago as we went through that ceremony, and the herbs that were burnt were so important to that.
Sounds like a powerful experience.
It was.
Yeah, and it is a good reminder that, like, the message of remember where your ancestors came from and don't side with Egypt is not just for ancient Israel and their descendants. It's a good reminder for all of us, right? And needs frequent bringing our attention back to that. It's so easy to like get really excited. Oh, we're going to be super anti-racist now because it's 2020 and George Floyd was murdered, and now it's 2024 and like anti-racist. What now? What are we talking about? And we need to be reminded.
Especially those of us who worship a man who was literally killed by the state for resisting the empire.
Yeah, we have committed ourselves to that remembrance and following in that path.
In the smoothest transition of all time. Speaking of death, what are y'all's thoughts on the angel of death?
Personally, I'm against him. Not a fan. Sorry. Not a fan.
Controversial take from Scott.
I was not ready for that.
I'm anti-angel of death.
I think Scott got it. Yeah, there's really nothing else to say.
It's real weird that here God has done all the other plagues on their own. The God hasn't needed an intermediary to do it. God sent the angels to go and look at Sodom and Gomorrah to report back and confirm that Sodom and Gomorrah still need to be destroyed, there's no implication that the angels were the one doing the destroying. It seems like God is always the one doing it. But here, God sends along this evil Santa Claus to go and carry out God's dirty work.
The directness of the death, it's not like with Sodom and Gomorrah, fire rained down from heaven, sulfur and whatever else, and something was happening. But here it's just like entity shows up and they die. There's no intermediate step. And I wonder if there's just an aversion to associating God that closely with death itself that is present in the writers' and editors' minds there.
Which is interesting because there's plenty of times in the Bible where God just straight up murders people. Like Onan and Ur, they were wicked. God killed them. It's that simple. So I don't know, maybe it's a scale that they're on, or maybe it's like wanting to show that God's dominion over death is so total that like he has someone who does it. He controls the forces that cause it. Maybe.
It's beneath him. And someone else can take care of that.
Yeah. Delegating. It's delegating.
And what's really funny is that, we've cut this off at verse 28, but in 29, it says, at midnight, the Lord struck down all the first offspring. So, like, on the one hand, do it so that the destroyer doesn't come and get you. On the other hand, God does it anyway.
And God tells Moses that God's going to do it. God says, hey, I'm going to kill all the firstborn in Egypt. And then Moses is like, hey, it's the destroyer. It's not God, it's the destroyer, but it is God. Don't worry about it.
That's really interesting. That Moses tells the people it's the destroyer, but God is actually the one doing it. That Moses is constructing this myth to protect their vision of who God is. But for some reason, we and all the readers of the story for the rest of time are in on the secret that Moses won't tell to his own people.
Huh.
Yeah, because Moses knows that, like, these people are going to have to rely on God to get them out of Egypt. They have a long journey ahead. So maybe Moses wants them to think that the destroyer will get you if you don't listen to me. The boogeyman will get you, but God, God loves you, and so God will be with you. Even while telling a story of a God who's frickin' scary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in terms of candidates for the angel of death, there are really 5 that are really interesting. A slightly more likely option is Samael. Samael is an archangel that appears in the Talmudic literature. The figure is also Satan in the book of Job, and he's supposed to be the head of the Satans. Now, Satans in Judaism are not demons, they're not devils, they are the accusers, they're the adversaries. They are part of God's loyal troop, but they're like the loyal opposition. They're like the people who are like, yeah, but what if you're wrong? One of the most interesting things about Samael is that Samael is supposed to be the guardian angel and prince of Rome. And because of that, he is the arch enemy of Israel. Samael is the ultimate opponent because he sides with empire instead of with the oppressed Israelite people. And so here, in this first story, he's supposed to be getting rid of the empire that they're facing. But later on, he becomes the symbol of Rome itself and the oppression that they're facing. And in later Talmudic literature, becomes a representative of Christianity because of his identification of Rome. And so this is a reminder that we as Christians have been an oppressive force before. And so we have to resist that and throw that out in order to be able to truly love our siblings. But this is one of the last times when the phrase, the Israelites went and did exactly what the Lord had commanded, is ever going to be uttered. Because the rest of the story is going to be about people messing up these commands and God continuing to love them. But here in this early part of the relationship, they're still getting to know each other. They're still figuring each other out. It's like the early dates of dating someone. You put your best foot forward and you show up on time despite the fact that you're late for everything. You bring flowers despite the fact that you hate flowers. You might even get a card. All those sort of things.
We've got 3 or 4 months before the golden calf?
Yeah, exactly. So, the messing up is going to happen pretty soon. But God keeps loving them. And even though they have been stuck in this terrible situation that was the result of a family divided, God is not willing for that division to happen between God and the family that God has chosen. And that's something that ultimately extends to all of us as well. That God has chosen for us to be a part of God's family. And even though the revolution that comes here, the liberation that God enacts for the people, is big and it's difficult and overthrows the world, God is still there to guide them, to love them. And God still needed Moses and Aaron to be able to do it. And so as we're thinking about these things, and the strange ritual, and the strange Passover, where we are not trying to combine different sources of life, where we're trying to make sure that life is held as the strange sacred thing in the midst of all this death, we have to look at the world, which is surrounded by death at all times, and be a place for life anyway. Be a place for love. Be a place where communities can grow and children can come and ask, what does this ritual mean to you? And we can say, we remember when we were once oppressed, and that is why we love on the oppressed now. Brandon, Ben, Scott, as always, absolutely wonderful to have you all on the podcast. I so appreciate each and every one of you. And I so appreciate you, dear listener, for leaving wonderful reviews, for sharing this podcast, for making memes and being on the Discord and contributing to the Patreon and all of the wonderful things that you do to be a part of this community. I so appreciate you, and I look forward to continuing to interact and continuing to put out some wonderful takes on passages that otherwise seem repetitive and strange, and we're not quite sure why they're in there twice, but that each of those has something to teach us about God and about each other. Pastor Micah, take it away.
And thank you, future Micah. The Word in Black and Red is a ministry of the Llama Pack Alternative Church, a home for everyone left on the outside. Your contributions help this working-class project invest in better tools and spend time organizing, recording, and editing this podcast. And hey, if you support this 16-year project, we might even get it done this decade. We use Patreon for now, but keep an eye out for when we switch to a more ethical way of supporting the show. You can join in the life of our community in our wonderful Discord, where you can chat with the folks you've heard this episode, find links to purchase our merch, and participate in a spiritual community for everyone seeking to build the kingdom of God. We're also a fun follow on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr, and Reddit. You can find the Discord, Patreon, and all the other ways to connect with us and these wonderful co-hosts in the show notes. Now, future Micah, say the profound shit.
And thank you, Pastor Micah. Now go and take part in the ritual of love that helps us to remember that we are kindred with the oppressed, that we take part in their life, and that love means taking on their burdens. Shalom. One of the other key references to hyssop is in Psalm 51:7, and I'm going to do this in the traditional chant because it's really quite beautiful. Purge me with hyssop and I shall be clean, and I drift away